Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Nadia Ali. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Aslı Bâli to you. I'm going to do this in a moment in greater detail. Thank you for coming. So today's event will be a conversation between Professor Aslı Bâli and myself about campus climate, about the various issues that have emerged over the last few months. And I should say that our conversation today, although it is going to focus on campus climate and politics more specifically linked to Middle East studies, this needs to be put in context. And that is the wider context of attacks on universities over the past years. We've seen this most obviously in relation to right-wing attacks on critical race theory, as well as assaults on universities' diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts to not only retain and recruit and retain faculty and students of color, but also attempts to transform education more profoundly. And whatever critique one might have of the more institutional DEI initiatives, they have contributed to some positive changes and have provided a leverage to address some structural forms of inequality and racism. Now, similarly, we have been witnessing increased condemnations of and arguments against gender and queer studies, especially in relation to queer and transgender issues. The latter has been prominent aspects of right-wing politics globally. I'm actually involved in writing or editing a book that looks at the way that anti-gender, homophobic discourses in politics are at the heart of right-wing movements in the Middle East and Europe, and one can extend that to the US as well. Now, within this wider recent context, there's also been a long history of Israel and Palestine being particularly sensitive topics, to put it mildly, especially within US academia. Organizations such as Campus Watch and Canary Mission have been monitoring as well as naming and trying to shame faculty and students for decades. But I would say that prior to the 7th of October, there was a shift away from what a colleague of mine years ago called PEFP, that is Progressive Except for Palestine. There was a shift, but since over the past months and since the brutal attack by Hamas on Israel and the subsequent devastating war on Palestinians, most notably in Gaza, but also the West Bank, Middle East Studies departments, centers, and faculty, as well as students, have been subject to a range of allegations and attacks. Across the country, faculty and students have been struggling in relation to a range of issues that we would like to explore in today's conversation. So let me introduce Professor Bâli to you. Aslı Bâli is professor of law at Yale Law School, where she teaches international law. Previously, she was professor at the UCLA School of Law, where she was the founding faculty director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights and director of the UCLA Center for Near Eastern Studies. Currently, Aslı Bâli serves as the president of the Middle East Studies Association, that is MESA, which is the largest international studies association dealing with the Middle East. Her research focuses on two broad areas: public international law, including human rights and humanitarian law, and comparative constitutional law, with a focus on the Middle East. Her scholarship has appeared in numerous law and peer-reviewed social science journals. I'm not going to go into great detail here, but I would like to mention that she is also co-chair of the Advisory Council for the Middle East and North Africa Division of Human Rights Watch, and a non-resident fellow of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. So please help me in welcoming Aslı Bâli. So Aslı and I will be in conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. We'll have some mics. So I'm going to sit down now. Okay, so let's see if this is on. It's on. This is working. Yes. Okay. So at Mesa in Montreal, I think it was the end of October, we had a meeting with head of departments of Middle East Studies and directors, and more recently we had an online meeting. And a range of issues and themes came up, that patterns that we have seen emerging nationally. I was wondering if you could share with us some of these patterns and the issues that these raise.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I just want to start by saying how important it is to be having this discussion and conversations like this one. I think that we're in an environment where communities are experiencing cleavages that they're not accustomed to. While it's true that Israel-Palestine has long been controversial on campuses, we have a much wider swath of people now involved in these debates. And part of that is because of decades of organizing around many of the things that you named, diversifying of university campuses, that you have a much wider range of students that are present. Also, faculties look different today than they did over the past decades. And so you have many more stakeholders, not only people who are necessarily focused in their studies on Middle East studies, and they're experiencing a wrenching moment now because they're not necessarily accustomed. While it's true that for those of us who are in this field, we may be familiar with this, they are experiencing circumstances they don't understand how to navigate. It's a de novo experience over and over again. One sees this. And the meeting that you noted, so we had a meeting, which we always do at the annual Middle East Studies Association conference, bringing together center directors from across the country. And there are campuses where this hasn't been an issue that has driven really the identity of the campus. Maybe it's focused on Islamic history, and maybe they have a lot of Egyptologists. Maybe it's a place where there are a lot of people working on Persian literature. For a variety of reasons, this hasn't been at the center, and yet every single one of them, to a one, was experiencing so much trauma by the time we're at that meeting. And I think that actual meeting was in the first week of November. I mean, the meeting began at the end of October, but the meeting you were describing at the conference was in the first week of November, that we couldn't end that meeting. People were in tears. I mean, people felt the need to just share what they were experiencing, to just speak. And then I had the uncomfortable experience of, in describing, I came and gave a very kind of quick thumbnail presentation about how to think about rights on campuses, how to think about knowing your rights, how to think about engaging on speech and events issues. And people behaved as if I was the oracle, as if I had come with the keys to the kingdom and I was going to be able to rescue us from this moment, which of course no rule book is going to be able to do. But it was a measure of the degree to which people felt that they were at sea in a moment where they just no longer had an ability to be oriented or to navigate what is and isn't permissible, because suddenly there was such a drastic narrowing of the spectrum of permissible speech on the one hand, such enormous consequences for stepping a toe over some line which wasn't even present there necessarily yesterday, or which may have been present but they were not aware of. So it's really a moment, I want to start by just acknowledging how fraught it is, and therefore how important it is to have conversations like this one where we can speak about, we can examine the thing we're experiencing with a measure of some distance to ask, what is it that's happening? What is it that we're experiencing? So then at Mesa, in addition to having meetings like this, we receive reports constantly from all across the country, again, disproportionately, obviously, from those who are involved in the study of the Middle East, but many of them find themselves implicated in the dynamics that are taking hold on campuses, whether or not it's happening at their centers or in their classrooms, because it's happening on the campus and they're seen as an expert in one way or another. They're either being sidelined by very virtue of their expertise, or they're being called upon nonstop to engage in various kinds of public dialogue fora, far from their actual scholarly identity, but nonetheless confronted constantly by what's happening on their campuses. And so they're reporting to us what's happening on their campuses. So I'll just say a word in answer to the core of your question, which is what are the patterns that we're seeing? They are really remarkable. I mean, to begin with, we're seeing outright racial profiling. And there have been some examples in the national media that have garnered attention, like the shooting of 3 Palestinian students in Vermont, or the fact that a student on Stanford University's campus was struck by a car in the midst of a protest. But actually, the violence has been much broader than that, but is not part of the national narrative at all. So one of the services I feel I can provide as a president of MESA specifically is drawing attention to that which is being obscured by the dominant narrative. The dominant narrative is one of an enormous uptick of anti-Semitic incidents on campuses. And I want to say, and we'll come back to this, I know in our conversation, I want to acknowledge that there is indeed a rise in anti-Semitic and as well as anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, and more generally, very tense interactions that at times make people feel that their identity is being called into question, that feel uncomfortable in ways that they only have a vocabulary grounded in discrimination or prejudice to address. So that exists. But at the same time, there's a political valence to the reason that we see that particular dominant narrative about what's happening on campuses, which stands in some tension with the actual pattern I'm going to describe now, which began with those instances of racial profiling, which were targeting people on the basis of wearing keffiyehs, which several of you may be doing right now in this room, or doing other things that overtly appeared to symbolize either that they were of Palestinian ancestry or Arab ancestry, or were aligned with people and were supporting the rights of people on this basis, and were targeted purely for that reason. So we're seeing an enormous amount of that beyond that which has been seen with the most extreme instances. We've also seen widespread violations of what I would describe as academic freedom, and I'm happy to come back to that throughout the course of our conversation, and also First Amendment on campuses. So selective enforcement of rules, for example, prior restraint on events on a content basis because the event is deemed critical of Israel and therefore somehow risky and not to be permitted, the disciplining of students and faculty who advocate for Palestinian rights, and I'll give a few examples of the kinds of things I'm talking about. Several universities have canceled screenings of the documentary film Israelism, as an example, which was produced by a set of young American Jews who felt disaffected from Israel and were by Israel and were providing an account of how they understood the experience of encountering the problems that they did as American Jews in the midst of a kind of culture that required them to show, in their view, in certain circles, a level of loyalty that they weren't prepared to perform. Yet on many campuses that have not permitted those screenings, that are well, first of all, the documentary produced by young American Jews, but also oftentimes being organized by progressive Jewish groups on campuses, those same campuses have allowed screenings of a kind of Israeli montage of images and footage from October 7th, which is presented as a straightforward narrative that is about the violence of the conflict at the moment, that is about Israel, but that is framed in a pro-Israel light. And so that kind of speech, even though it has many of the same problems, Israelism is not being permitted because it might engender forms of debate or exchange that could be hurtful to some on the campus, and so that's the basis for the prior restraint, and yet it's very clear that the charged content of that montage of footage that has been screened on many campuses has exactly the same sets of risks, but yet is being allowed to go forward. So this is what I mean by selective enforcement or prior restraint that's content specific. Student groups, including student groups like Jewish Voices for Peace, have been suspended on several campuses for alleged infractions of time, manner, location regulations for events, and then upon investigation, and MESA is amongst the organizations, but several civil rights organizations have also been involved with this in pursuing the question of academic freedom in the context of these suspensions. Upon investigation, one finds that the rules were actually adopted ad hoc just before a set of events, and so that students may not even have been on notice about the new regulations that they purportedly violated. So this is basically a set of bespoke rules that are being themselves implemented on a content and viewpoint specific basis. Some universities have gone so far as to prohibit specific words and phrases on the basis that they are concerned that Title VI might preclude the use of these kinds of words that cause students to feel threatened and may therefore lawfully be banned, and students using these words can face discipline. So an example of such a word is intifada, which is an Arabic word for uprising. An example of a phrase is from the river to the sea. Now, to imagine what it means to be on a campus where Arabic language words are being prohibited on the grounds that they make other people feel uncomfortable raises questions about a slippery slope. I mean, I'll return to the intifada question, but what if the word for soup or the word for sky or the word for university could be mistaken for a word that might have content that would make somebody feel uncomfortable by virtue of it being Arabic? I mean, where would we have a line to be drawn on the use of foreign language words that make people feel uncomfortable unless we have a normative account of what's wrong with the word? But of course, that normative account is not being provided precisely because there's nothing wrong with the content of the word. It's a descriptive word, just as there's nothing wrong with the word uprising free of context in the English language. It's the context that makes a difference. One can analyze the context, but to have per se speech restrictions that create lists of forbidden words is almost the definition of a violation of free speech and academic freedom at a university context. Let's think about from the river to the sea. What does it mean to teach Middle East studies, to talk about the contemporary politics of the conflict in the region and not be able to describe the phrases being used by the Prime Minister of Israel in his own description of the forms of control that Israel, under his government, intends to exert in Mandate Palestine? I couldn't teach that if I couldn't use that phrase, or I would have to creatively find a different translation than from the river to the sea to describe the actual statements being made by the Israeli government, let alone what Palestinian actors may or may not be saying. So context-free lists of prohibited words, to my mind, represent literally the inversion of the commitments that a university should have in a moment like this one. And again, we can come back to what I understand to be the pedagogical obligations of the university. We've also received reports of instances in which university and college leadership have infringed on faculty academic freedom by scrutinizing syllabi and curricula that have content critical of Israel, or that may be construed as such because they engage with themes such as decolonization, settler colonialism, specific Arabic words or phrases are used in the syllabus or in the content that's been assigned, and these are all being described inaccurately, mischaracterized as presumptively anti-Semitic in some way. And these particular scrutiny of syllabi and curricula occurred especially in between the two semesters, so between over the course of December and January, as universities that were reeling from the sets of tensions that erupted on campuses in the fall semester were trying to take stock and imagine how can they manage the spring semester better. But the exact wrong thing to do to manage a spring semester better in the wake of tensions on campus over contentious, controversial issues of public concern is to try to censor faculty teaching or to intervene from above in pedagogical choices that are being made by the faculty. It's the very, again, negation of any meaningful understanding, to my mind, of what academic freedom means. Against this backdrop of these patterns, the chilling effect has been very, very real. Not only in the room where center directors are in tears trying to describe their experiences, and staff of those centers are in tears describing the kinds of judgments they're being asked to make as to what constitutes permissible or impermissible conduct, what is threatening and what is not threatening, et cetera. They feel under attack. But the chilling effect is also on the ability to engage in critical speech, including even venues like this one, without the worry that you're either going to fall afoul of some new disciplinary rule or that consequences that are related to external actors' pressure on the campus are going to be so high that the cost of defending academic freedom stops being worth it. And if there's any bottom line message of the exchange that we're going to have and the position Mesa takes, is that that cost is always worth it, even in moments like this one where external actors are trying to extract very serious taxes on the willingness of a university to defend its status as a place where controversial ideas can be freely debated and rigorously examined and scrutinized by academic standards.
Thank you. I was actually going to ask about academic freedom, and just maybe to add, I think you've sort of covered most of the questions I had, but one of the questions...
We just get a quick round of applause.
No, I'd like to talk in detail about that.
Yes. So we also here at Brown, I mean, this is of course a contested issue, academic freedom, not just in this country, but globally. At Brown, I think we are comparatively in a sort of much better situation, and I'm not just saying that because our president and provost are here. But of course, you know, we do identify and recognize some of these patterns as well. But how, maybe if you can go into a little bit more detail in terms of the question of how do we talk about academic freedom in the current context, and what is the difference between academic freedom and free speech or freedom of speech? We had that discussion in a faculty meeting previously. And also, you know, what are the generic issues and what is specific to this political moment? And what, if any, academic freedom issues are specific to Israel-Palestine in your view?
Great, thank you. So I'm glad that you pointed out that this is a global issue. Mesa actually just engaged in a submission to the United Nations expert body that's examining patterns of academic freedom globally. This is still working out. So we've actually been thinking about this in an international context, and I should say, I'll say a little bit more about Mesa advocacy down the line, but we have a committee on academic freedom, and historically it's been much more active in intervening in debates about academic freedom in the region, the Middle East and North Africa, that is coming to the defense of our colleagues in Egypt and Turkey and Iran and elsewhere who face radical restrictions. And it's interesting to see now that our Committee on Academic Freedom that addresses North American issues has become the more active in this most recent era, and are drawing on many of the materials we put together for the MENA context, because some of the same problems are arising on campuses, not something I would ever have imagined would be the case if you'd asked me in August or September of this academic year, whether I could imagine a scenario like that in our Committee on Academic Freedom. But okay, so let me just start from some first principles. To begin with, public universities are required to abide by the First Amendment directly. But most private universities and private colleges have codes that pledge to uphold principles of free speech, but we're not talking about the constitutional domain there. We're not talking about First Amendment protections as such. This does nonetheless mean, and this is true, again, I have not scrutinized Brown's particular code, but it means typically the following things which are analogous to the First Amendment context. First, there is an absolute right to engage in political speech on campuses, whether in writing or orally, that is a protected element of any meaningful code that purports to protect freedom of speech. That viewpoint discrimination is not allowed. That is a First Amendment principle that has been imported into almost all private universities and colleges. As at the theoretical level, I've already suggested that they're departing from that practice at the moment. That speech can only be limited if it becomes threatening in terms of immediate harm or encouraging of unlawful activity. This is settled doctrine at the constitutional level that has been imported into most campuses. And in fact, this was the kind of thing that tripped up university presidents at a congressional hearing when they're being questioned by Representative Elise Stefanik, because they took for granted, even though they were speaking about private university campuses, they took for granted elements that are the cardinal core pillars of what it means to speak about free speech in this country. And yet, and again, in a bizarre turnabout, it was the American Congress, the very place that is the source of many of these laws or these interpretations, and has repeatedly confirmed these interpretations from the Constitutional Court, were the ones that were expressing shock in the face of university presidents offering what was essentially a benign defense of core First Amendment principles. But in any case, speech can only be limited if threatening immediate harm or encouraging unlawful activity, and public speaking may be subject to time, manner, location restrictions and regulations, and most university codes have these, but they themselves have to be viewpoint neutral. So that's basically what free speech means typically on campuses. This is not the same as academic freedom. There's enormous overlap between academic freedom and freedom of speech, but they're not coterminous. Academic freedom is a set of protections that are related to the specific professional activities and vocation of those who are on campuses. They are role-specific protections and freedoms that relate to the production of scholarship, research, the engagement in teaching. Students who are engaging in research and writing of their own enjoy these kinds of freedoms. Certainly faculty are intended to be protected by these freedoms, and they're tied to an understanding of the necessary conditions for excellence in research and scholarship. That means testing controversial ideas. That means pursuing the truth in circumstances even when the ideas or the research trajectories may be unpopular in some crude political sense, but in a campus are absolutely the bread and butter of what those who are assembled here are assembled to do, provided that they are subjecting any one of these ideas to rigorous, disciplined scholarly inquiry. That's the nature of our craft. That's what we're doing. And this extends to classroom protections of academic freedom, the pedagogical choices that faculty make in determining how to train students to engage in precisely that same kind of critical knowledge production. That is the name of the game, if you want, of what universities should be doing. And when scholars engage in extramural speech, some of these same protections apply by analogy, because a circumstance in which extramural speech, in which scholars are applying their expertise that is the basis of their professional identity on the campus to matters of social concern, even when, again, those questions are themselves a topic of controversy in the political moment, are examples of using expertise for the purpose of advancing knowledge, and indeed even for purposes of democratic participation. And to intervene in that speech on the grounds that it's extramural, that it's not directly tied to the particular research functions of a scholar, is to engage in a kind of restriction that undermines the underlying commitments of the university. So we imagine protections of extramural speech to be something like prophylactic rules, rules that are there in order to counteract the risk that restrictions of speech could actually serve to undermine the foundational commitments to academic freedom. So it's not relevant that the extramural speech is not strictly connected to a particular research function, a particular scholarly project, or a particular classroom context normally. This is our normal thought. And so I'm just going to quote from one of my colleagues who is a First Amendment scholar and really one of the leading people in the United States that has spoken on the constitutional protections that attach to academic freedom, Robert Post at the Yale Law School. He says, academic freedom establishes the liberty necessary to advance knowledge, exploring controversial ideas and arguments by subjecting them to rigorous and disciplined application of scholarly modes of inquiry. Now, this is different than free speech, which is a broader set of protections. Those protections are grounded in different foundations. The foundations of free speech protections that we all enjoy within the university and outside of the university as participants in the broader the polity that we're living in are grounded in a rationale of respecting the democratic and egalitarian commitments of our society and the right of all persons to participate because they have an equal right to contribute to the public discourse, and the state must refrain from deciding which speech should be suppressed, discounted, or advanced. So the First Amendment is a restriction on state actors, and the notions about free speech are notions about restricting authority figures. So again, as I say, at a public university, the university administration may be state actors, right? It's an extension of state government. That's why the First Amendment applies directly. In a private campus setting, though, the same thought is present that we should all be able to participate from a free speech perspective in the public discourse of our campus community, and those with authority should not use that authority to suppress particular speech or advance other kinds of speech. So these are distinctions. Now, this all pertains to extramural speech. So we have an account of academic freedom and how it is connected to extramural speech. We have an account of free speech itself as a kind of democratic practice and commitment to egalitarianism that is the grounding of why we don't suppress speech. When it comes to extramural speech in the current environment, universities are across the board struggling to tolerate controversial speech on campus, let alone engagement in controversial extramural speech by the faculty, because the damaging consequences to the university in the form of threats by donors and alums and government actors and the media have radically increased the costs associated with defending academic freedom. Now, it is always costly. There's always a cost associated with that defense. That cost has gone up, and it's gone up because of the pressure being exerted by external entities, not only to approve of particular kinds of speech, but importantly in this particular moment, to disapprove of other kinds of speech. So we have a universe already where universities in the neoliberal kind of economy are subject to donor endowments and donor commitments that advance particular kinds of speech. We're used to that universe at the university in which donor preferences, alumni preferences may mean one area is better funded, government priorities may mean some kinds of research are better funded, but this is extraordinary, the extraordinary intervention in campus life to suppress particular kinds of speech. And this is especially threatening because it threatens the autonomy of academic institutions, the autonomy that already, as I've described, is constrained to some extent by the political economy of higher education already, right? The very status that donors and alums enjoy indicates that there are some constraints. But those constraints are now being weaponized in a way that really goes at the heart of what it means to say that universities can be autonomous. And it also undermines principles of open inquiry and debate that, to my mind, are essential for the advancement of knowledge, development of critical thinking skills, all the things that are being protected by academic freedom. So the specific issues that relate to then academic freedom in the context of Israel-Palestine really are just a particular instance of a broader phenomenon that is deeply threatening to the university, to its autonomy, to the nature of our practices. And as you've said in your opening remarks, Nadia, we've already seen this at the governmental level across the board in states like Florida and Texas and elsewhere, from anti-CRT statutes to new regulations governing the life and the ability to speak about gender, sexual identity, sexual orientation. All of these things have already been present in our public sphere in a very dramatic and deleterious way for the autonomy of universities and for the protection of academic freedom. And Israel-Palestine has been a particular instance today that is part of this broader right-wing environment of coming up with phrases and ideas that are deemed impermissible, that end up on those lists of prohibited words and concepts.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about Islamophobia. So we have a new website at Brown that is listing resources, educational resources about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. There is an ongoing debate about the kinds of definitions in relation to anti-Semitism. I'm not going to go into that, but I mean, as you might imagine, the IRA definition is mentioned, and as a consequence of a number of faculty and students engaging with each other and the people who have put together the website, the Jerusalem Declaration has been added. But actually, I want to speak about Islamophobia because my concern is that the website lists one resource under Islamophobia, Well, I'm not sure that what we are seeing, what you were describing in terms of the patterns, what myself and colleagues and students are experiencing can really be categorized as such. I mean, I feel other things are going on. Anti-Arab racism, anti-Palestinianism. Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly what it is, but it is not just Islamophobia. Islamophobia might be an aspect of it. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. So I'll begin with a kind of academic intervention about just terminology, and then I'll zoom back out to this political moment. On the academic point on terminology, I really dislike the word Islamophobia. Islamophobia focuses on a phobia. It imagines the problem of prejudice as a problem, or the problem of discrimination as a problem of prejudice, of some individual pathological response to a particular prompt that doesn't point to structural factors, that doesn't point to the broader context, and that particularizes the problem of discrimination. So I think the preferred term ought to be anti-Muslim racism for those who want to look at the phenomenon that they're describing as Islamophobia. But you're right, whatever you call it, whether you call it Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism, is totally inappropriate to this moment. It is a topic that universities ought to be very concerned with, and they should have been concerned with it for some quarter century, as I mentioned in a previous conversation, because of the racialization of Muslim communities in this country in the context of the war on terror that, of course, predates October 7th, and indeed actually predates the war on terror, maybe could be traced back to the Iranian Revolution or maybe even earlier. But the framing of Muslims as threat, the kinds of structural forms of discrimination that Muslim communities have been subjected to, ought to be a concern, just as all forms of diversity, equity, inclusion are a concern. But in the context of October 7th, it's a complete misdirection. And it's a misdirection for some of the reasons you were suggesting. First of all, of course, like the persons that are engaging in either criticism of the conduct of hostilities by the Israelis, criticism of state policies on the part of the Israelis, or defense and support of Palestinian rights are not primarily even Muslim, let alone solely Muslim. I mean, there's whole communities have been mobilized that are, for one thing, critical Jewish voices, progressive Jewish voices, but secular people and Christian people and people from completely different faith traditions, people from all kinds of backgrounds, including, of course, Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims of all kinds, but a much wider swath of people. So it misunderstands who is experiencing repression when pro-Palestinian speech or speech critical of Israel is being subjected to the kind of suppression or the pattern that I've described. Actually, for example, what you will find in the cases of individual students being disciplined or students that have faced consequences where employers have withdrawn offers of employment, they are disproportionately brown and black students who are not Muslim and actually not necessarily even from the Middle East or without necessarily heritage connections to the Middle East, which is its own striking reality about the kinds of coalitions that have been built and the reasons we see this much wider set of debates around Israel-Palestine on universities today. But because the individuals who engage in this kind of speech cannot be defined strictly as Muslim, a focus on anti-Muslim racism is inadequate to the moment, although it may capture some of what's happening, and I've already described circumstances where there is active racial discrimination taking place, where people are either identified as or presumed to be Arab or Muslim, as in the case of the students who were shot for wearing keffiyehs, et cetera, where, of course, we also do have clear expressions of some version of racism, whether it's because anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian, et cetera. But there are two other problems that make this a form of misdirection. One is describing the problem as one of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, this kind of like balance account, is almost imagining the campus politics as some kind of microcosm of the conflict in Israel-Palestine and understanding that conflict in sacred terms. So sacralizing a conflict and imagining that this is a war between Muslims and Jews. And as a consequence, we're seeing, actions that are harming Jewish and Muslim communities on our campuses, and we should worry. And this is, again, wrong, entirely wrong. What we have is a political conflict, a national conflict over a particular territory, a conflict over land, not a war of Muslims and Jews. And so when my daughter comes home and reports to me that she's worried about what it means about her identity when her classmates in the second grade are saying to her, well, you're both Muslim and Jewish, so are you at war with yourself? It's one thing. But to understand universities and people engaged in graduate study and professors describing the conflict in these kinds of reductive terms and imagining that this is a war of Muslims and Jews is wrong. But in many ways, that is why we see this kind of both sides as in parallel being made of, well, the problems are about Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. And then finally, And the last concern is that there is a conflation here of anti-Palestinian sentiment with Islamophobia that overlooks the specificities of the kinds of racism you were pointing to a moment ago, of anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian bias that are prevalent in various institutional contexts and have a long structural history. This discrimination is rooted in a complex web of historical, political, and social factors that A, transcend religious identity, and B, are connected to that context I mentioned a moment ago, the quarter century long or half century long or even longer context in which anti-terrorism law, for example, has framed Palestinians as a source of threat as such. And so measures that are purport to suppress pro-Palestinian speech, regardless of who the speaker is, are oftentimes piggybacking on that overall framing. So there's been a very good piece that was written recently that I commend to your attention. The author is a professor of anthropology and law at the University of Chicago named Darrell Lee, and he wrote the report together with the Center for Constitutional Rights, and it tracks the relationship between anti-terrorism laws in this country dating back to 1969 and the conflation of Palestinians with terrorism, the conflation of the Palestinian cause with the problem of terrorism. So what's happening when suppression occurs around speech having to do with Palestinian identity is that it builds upon a long history of structural racism that is Palestine-specific, not Palestinian-specific, because, of course, those laws, so just to give an example, the Oklahoma City bombing, right, which was carried out by white nationalists in 1995 and resulted in a statute being passed that was largely about anti-immigrant restrictions, because notwithstanding the fact that this was a form of domestic terrorism that occurred as a homegrown matter, immigrant communities were demonized, has a through line on a specific framing of the anxiety and concern about Palestinian violence in the statute that was passed in the wake of the Oklahoma City bombing. So you see a kind of conceptualization of Palestine as such a threat that is, I think, prevalent at this moment, and of course completely exceeds any account of anti-Muslim racism or Islamophobia, but also exceeds any idea that this is about affinity groups or identity categories of the speaker. Instead, it's about the speaker taking a political position with respect to a longstanding political question that has come to be conflated with the question of terrorism in the minds of Americans.
Yeah, well, that brings me to another issue. I mean, mentioned it before, the issue of anti-Semitism. And like you, I'm aware, and I don't want to belittle the real increase in anti-Semitism, not just on campuses, but, you know, outside globally. But we also know that many of us working in Middle East studies, or as well students, have been accused of anti-Semitism as a way to silence us, as a way to criminalize us. So what is your advice to those of us under attack?
So let me start by why is this happening. So most people in this room may be familiar with the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, but the core problem in that definition, and it's not just IRA, but many other sort of political moves in the contemporary climate that don't even reference the definition but engage in the same strategy, is the conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, or the conflation of criticism of Israeli state policies or actions or conduct of hostilities with anti-Semitism. And this strategy is very dangerous for a set of reasons I want to name before I then turn to some advice. And it is connected to that broader right-wing attack on higher education as a whole. So the purpose of a move like this one, which conflates criticism of a state with a form of impermissible and toxic discrimination, and again, I want to acknowledge, as you did, that an upsurge in actual acts of anti-Semitic discrimination on campuses is very worrying. But it's very distinct from political protest speech or speech that has to do with criticism of the state of Israel or supportive of Palestinian rights. And the conflation is dangerous for a host of reasons. One, it detracts from and distracts our attention from instances of real discrimination across the board. So I've already said this overbroad definition risks undermining efforts to address anti-Semitism by blurring the line between discrimination and debates about Middle Eastern politics. It makes it impossible to teach about the Middle East in this moment, because at any moment you're at risk of offering a critical reading or a critical piece that is then presented as per se somehow anti-Semitic. It also erases the political diversity within the Jewish community itself. It suggests that there is a way in which if any attack on Zionism or any criticism of Israel is necessarily anti-Semitic, then all Jewish people are necessarily identified with Zionism or the projects of the Israeli state. These two things can't be disaggregated from one another. And actually, we have an extraordinarily diverse Jewish community in this country, in the United States, and enormous scholarly disagreement within the field of Jewish studies as well, all of which gets flattened completely by this account. So we had, for example, an interesting moment where this was acknowledged politically and kind of uncomfortably when Representative Gerald Nadler, some of you might have seen this, or Nadler, perhaps he pronounces it, from New York, stood up and he said, I have to oppose this conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism because I represent communities that are very obviously anti-Zionist and not anti-Semitic. And what he was talking about was Hasidic communities, Orthodox Jewish communities in his district in New York City that are very anti-Zionist, that are committed actually as a religious matter to anti-Zionism, but of course to treat them and their anti-Zionist speech as per se anti-Semitic would be mistaken, to say the least. And that's an easy case to understand, that if you have, on the basis of your Orthodox Jewish commitments, criticisms of the Zionist project, it's very difficult to conflate that criticism with anti-Semitism. But the logic, of course, should extend to all communities, including all Jewish communities. So there's also a long Jewish labor history of the Jewish labor movement that was deeply anti-Zionist, as an example, but also secular. And that actually is a kind of set of debates within the Jewish community that we see today, that lineage, that genealogy continuing in precisely organizations like Jewish Voices for Peace. So in adopting this conflation and then suppressing voices like Jewish Voices for Peace, campuses, university administrators are essentially saying, we have to adopt a definition of anti-Semitism that precludes us from recognizing diverse Jewish voices on our own campuses. The nature of our understanding of anti-Semitism means you can't be this or that kind of Jewish person. You have to be precisely this kind of Orthodox Jewish. I mean, we're going to tell you the orthodoxy of what it is to be Jewish on a university campus today, and it is to be committed to Zionism. That's very problematic as a move, totally independent of what it means for people who are pro-Palestinian or trying to support Palestinian rights. But of course, in practice, it's true that Zionism itself implicates the interests of Palestinians, that's exactly the nature of the conflict that's taking place in Israel-Palestine. And so the danger that any assertion that is critical of Zionism is necessarily anti-Semitic is also to say we're going to engage in a direct act of erasure of the Palestinian experience. Palestinians are not allowed to talk about their experience, not allowed to talk about the forms of discrimination they're subjected to, not allowed to talk about the kinds of violence that is being visited on their communities, because that kind of speech is deemed critical of Israel and therefore is per se anti-Semitic. All of these things are in a university, and it's one thing, and of course one of the authors famously of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism has absolutely disavowed its use in universities, indeed disavowed its use to regulate speech in any way. It was meant to be instructive, give examples of instances of anti-Semitism that one might worry about, but has been used in this other way. And I would argue that it's being used, again, in the context of a broader right-wing set of attacks on higher education by movements and groups that themselves have very little respect for the kinds of diversity I spoke about a moment ago in the Jewish community, that actually their political agenda is in tension in many instances, even with the interests of the Jewish community, that even those in the Jewish community who are pro-Israel should worry about the kinds of bedfellows they find themselves in this kind of set of right-wing attacks. But in terms of advice, which you asked for, I think it's really important to clearly articulate the focus of the critique, right? To draw a clear distinction between government actions and policies that one abhors or criticizes and commentary targeting individuals or communities, that's obvious. But also it's important to do the very thing that you've named that Brown has done, which is to engage with competing definitions of anti-Semitism. These competing definitions are emerging out of Jewish studies, out of the kinds of debates that reflect the diversity of Jewish perspectives. And so for every invocation of IRA, there are also Jerusalem declarations and other possibilities that one might invoke. And one should be aware of the scope and spectrum of those debates. I think that one of the problems, we see it playing out again at Harvard at the moment, is in choosing to express ourselves in pro-Palestinian ways, et cetera, particularly as we have a much broader set of coalitions, people who haven't spent all of their careers or all of their student life grappling with these questions, but are arriving now to see the kind of broader coalitional politics that have emerged around Israel-Palestine and thinking through race and decolonial strategies and many other things that have created a big tent around these protests. You find people reaching back to use logos, images, emblems, et cetera, that are identified with emancipation, but that may in fact inadvertently encompass anti-Semitic tropes. Like, for example, this most recent experience that you may be aware of at Harvard, in which a cartoon from the 1960s was repurposed in order to really reflect the continuities of campus politics around the question of Palestine and Black liberation. And those are very important, long-standing historical trajectories, a scholarly genealogy that one should certainly examine. It's undermined, the critical intervention is undermined when you have, in one way or another, a failure of scrutiny to understand what are these logos, what do they mean, what are the symbolic significance or connotations in that era or in this one of a particular image, et cetera. So one can be very careful about how you frame. And in a way, I think, for anybody who has been a long-standing participant in these debates, there's a unique kind of obligation that is owed, honestly, to anybody who feels that they are engaging in pro-Palestinian speech to be extraordinarily responsible, precisely because Palestinians find themselves in an extraordinarily marginalized and vulnerable situation. And those who purport to speak for them have any mistake they made, imputed back to Palestinians, to the Palestinian movement, to the Palestinian cause. And so there's a heightened obligation, I think, for anyone whose claims on a university campus or elsewhere to be speaking in defense of or on behalf of or in solidarity with Palestinians to be particularly careful about exactly how their arguments are framed and what images they use, et cetera. Finally, the last two things, I think it's incredibly important to document instances in which pro-Palestinian speech is being suppressed, to document the experiences that you're having, and to publicize unfounded accusations, including unfounded accusations of anti-Semitism that are addressed against this kind of organizing, because I think we need to understand and have a much more robust and granular account of what's happening on our campuses than the one that's in the dominant narrative. And then this occasion is a great example of exactly what I would advise, which is to engage in public education, to have open discussions about the problems that we're seeing on our campuses and thinking through the challenges that they raise and not shying away from the controversy by basically minimizing anything that engages with the question of Israel and Palestine on our campuses.
Yeah. Well, you already mentioned there are several universities, including Brown, that are under Title VI investigation right now. There have been complaints. But while you mention the list of patterns, and we've experienced some at Brown, but colleagues are experiencing it around the country, I'm personally not aware of any sort of legal recourse taken on that side or even formal complaints. Why is that? And what can we do, and what role is MESA taking in this context?
Yeah, so this has to do, to my mind, with the structural conditions I described around defending, speaking on Palestine or purporting to defend Palestinian rights, et cetera, when Palestine is so often understood as threat, and when material support statutes, counterterrorism efforts, the war on terror more broadly, has produced patterned habits in the communities that have most frequently been invested in pro-Palestinian speech of suspicion and fear of engagement with authorities. So let me just give an example. Imagine, and sadly this isn't far from being hypothetical, many people have experienced this, that someone of Palestinian descent is being harassed or attacked while displaying a Palestinian flag or wearing a keffiyeh. Okay, like imagine that this has happened. On the face of it, this looks like it might reflect a form of anti-Palestinian racism or be a kind of bias or discrimination incident that ought to be reported to authorities, universities, it could be the basis of a Title VI complaint, et cetera. But in the current environment, the individual that was subjected to this attack would have real reason to fear that in the act of reporting this discrimination, they might themselves perversely elicit a criticism of anti-Semitism or become the object themselves of an investigation in some way, or might become the symbol of this conflict in a way that would bring unwanted attention to them, that would invite doxing efforts towards them and so forth. And so they may be very reluctant to come forward even to their university administration, let alone to the Department of Justice or the Department of Education. So this is a very profound problem, and it's a reason why I think actually organized reporting efforts are lagging, but it's so important, particularly for those of us who have a level of protection that academic freedom still affords. So for faculty to actually engage in this reporting in a very systematic way and to engage in documentation in a systematic way, because we have the relative privilege and protection, particularly if you're post-tenure, of being in a tenured position. And you can afford to take the risk of that kind of boomerang effect that reporting can induce at times for people that are reporting discrimination on this basis. But there is a lack of good data because of the sort of the chilling effect that has significantly limited the likelihood of the community that is experiencing this kind of discrimination reporting it. We don't have good data. And on the other side, because of the conflation of of anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, we have data that's also very bad about what's actually happening on our campuses, in which organized efforts are being made to depict the campus as a hotbed of anti-Semitism because campuses have so much critical speech about Israel taking place. And so on the one hand, there's an account that says there's a massive amount of anti-Semitic conduct on campuses, but when you dig down and try to find out what happened on this campus or that campus, you learn there was an protest of Israeli state actions, there was criticism of the state of Israel, or even more often, there was a pro-Palestine solidarity event that was tagged as somehow engaging in anti-Semitic speech because of the conflation with anti-Zionism. So you have the data on the side of anti-Semitism being blurred by that conflation, and then you have a lack of data on the other side by the fact that people are not reporting. So what is MESA doing in this environment? A number of things. First of all, data collection efforts. So we've created a survey instrument. We've distributed it very broadly through our centers, the center directors, but through our listserv that reaches our 6,000 or so members and former members, and then trying to advertise it in partnership with civil rights organizations to get people to think about the value of reporting. So one of the things that other organized groups have been very good at is reminding people to engage in this kind of reporting in 4 different ways. Report to your university officials, report to the Department of Education, which has this Title VI set of complaints, report to the Department of Justice that has a separate complaint mechanism, and report to civil rights organizations that are working on issues relating to your community. So that's 4 different kinds of reporting for every instance of an incident. And on our side, 0 level of reporting. And by our side, I mean for those who are trying in the context of Middle East studies to gather data about what's happening on our campuses in the wake of October 7th. So we've created the survey instrument. We've tried to present it in a way that is less threatening, but also it includes prefatory language that explains the value of documentation and why it is important to report while we understand the chilling effect and the sources of it. We have tried to engage in legal support. So we actually are, when people come and report experiences that they're having, we do a number of things. One thing we do is just the advocacy we do in general on academic freedom questions. We write letters. So university presidents may tire of my name, which otherwise is maybe very obscure, but suddenly becomes well known to them because I've been writing letters to university administrators, to campuses about specific instances of harassment or intimidation or discriminatory conduct or discipline that has been exacted upon students and faculty on their campuses, and that's part of our ordinary advocacy efforts. But when these issues now arise, we've also come into partnership with a set of legal organizations, civil rights organizations, so we help try to connect people to legal support and also to advocacy organizations that might work on their behalf. And then we've tried to pull together educational resources. So we have a campus climate page of resources that give you models of excellent statements in defense of academic freedom, ranging from the statements that have been put out by chapters and also the National Association of American University Professors, AAUP, but also statements from the ACLU, statements from a whole range of different kinds of organizations that really reflect models of what you should be asking your campus to do, and also letters that have intervened in other instances on other campuses that might mirror what you're experiencing on your campus and you can draw upon as you think about what is the engagement you want to have with campus administrators. I mean, in a know your rights context, I would underscore how important it is to be in an open communication with and engage in dialogue with university administration. Oftentimes, they enter into a kind of defensive crouch. They presume that there's going to be a hostile relationship, and those presumptions are often like self-fulfilling prophecies. It's important for people to know who you are, even if your views are controversial, even if you're a person that brings, media attention to the campus in ways that university administrators might not prefer. If they're in conversation with you, if they understand the sources of the position that you take, your scholarship, your expertise, the value that you bring to the university, and you explain to them the position you're taking, you're in a far better position for your own advocacy than if you understand yourself to be in a hostile camp. So again, I applaud Brown for having the provost and university president here. I think it's incredibly important to engage with university administrators, but when you engage in that communication, it's sometimes hard to know how to frame it. And so the Campus Climate Resources page is an attempt to give all kinds of models that encompass all the different kinds of situations we've seen of what we think are excellent interventions, excellent ways of communicating, excellent engagements in order to give faculty and students resources and models to think about how they might undertake this. And then finally, we've been trying to engage in public statements, public education, not just writing privately to university presidents or whatever, but also putting out broader statements to our membership and more broadly about what we're called to do in this moment. Because I do believe deeply that the university and those of us who work and labor within the university have obligations that are heightened in this moment, to not shrink from the controversy, but to rise to it. And it's hard to understand exactly how to think that through, and so we're trying as an association and just as a set of scholars that are really invested in thinking about the role of the university in moments like this one to model what that could mean.